Great Day Houston.
Up next, May is Historic Preservation Month, celebrating the nation's heritage through historic places and buildings like the River Oaks Theater. Can you imagine San Antonio without the Alamo? Many parts were demolished over the years, and there was a battle to save the rest. Houston without the Astrodome? That's a building still hanging in limbo. We'll take a look at how preservation and modernization can coexist. If walls could talk, they would choose our next guest to have a conversation with. Unfortunately, in our haste over the years to expand and modernize, many important historical buildings have been demolished. Many parts of the Alamo in San Antonio were torn down or repurposed over the years. Today, it's been designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The White House is another iconic building that faced demolition at one time as well. Historian Raffi Andonian says, when we tear down historical buildings, we also rip out a part of our story. May is Historical Preservation Month, and he shared why it's important. Raffi, when it comes to preservation, we oftentimes say in Houston, for a long time, what we would do is, tear it down and make way for the new, out with the old, in with the new. And then we started to realize, wait a minute, we're tearing down a part of our history. That's the importance of preservation.
That's right, and actually that's why there's an organization here in Houston known as Preservation Houston.
Yeah, they've been on the show several times.
Yeah. And revitalizing a downtown and having that district, and that district that allows people to engage with the built environment over time that so many generations have come through. But a lot of times historic preservation is thought of as kind of behind the red rope and untouchable. But I think the way we should think about it, it's not necessarily a preservation professional or a museum. It could be your own home that has a historic character that you like and you want to learn how to be able to protect its character while updating it. It's sometimes as simple as that. A homeowner or a business person who wants to be in a cool space that's in a historic building that has a certain character. So a lot of times it's actually what private citizens do. It's not necessarily a regulation or a museum.
Yeah.
And I think that what we choose to remember from the past tells a lot about who we are in the present and what we are deciding to tell the future about our identity.
Yeah,
and I think that's how I think of preservation. It's really about the future.
And it has so much character. I was in Greenville, South Carolina recently, and we were riding around the town, and this feels like where every Hallmark movie should be made. But they made a concerted effort to actually take all those old buildings and they modernized them inside, because you got to have them modernized, right? You got to have this thing called an air conditioner, right? Stuff like that. But they preserved as much as the character as they could, and it was interesting how, although new buildings can be beautiful and fancy, the feeling we had driving around that town was different. The feeling you have going to an old building is different.
I would call that feeling a sense of place, because then what you have with that feeling is this that I'm seeing and feeling here is only something that I get here in Greenville or in downtown Houston or wherever the case is that you're going. Yes. And so that's a sense of place. Whereas sometimes when we build the same way across the country, then it doesn't matter whether I'm in South Carolina or Texas or California, it feels the same. So you lose that sense of place. And so that character to me is that sense of place that you're describing, because it gives it an identity that is local. And that's why I say that preservation is really about a form of creating identity, and you are making decisions in what you decide to protect and not protect or change, and that is deciding what identity is.
And what you were saying earlier about individuals doing it with their homes, we saw that with neighborhoods. The Heights, for example, has always been a neighborhood where you can drive through and go, oh, the architecture all just changed. It went back to the bungalows of the 30s and stuff. And then there was a part of the city as well where when we decided that mid-century modern, it's interesting how you have to get far away from something, far enough away from something, because there was a moment, there was a moment when everything 50s and 60s, we were like, ugh, what were we thinking? Now it's like, oh, the sleekness of the 50s and the 60s.
Yeah, and now speaking of historic homes, how about we talk about George Washington's home, Mount Vernon, because there was a time, believe it or not, when Mount Vernon, George Washington's home, was being decided as to whether they should keep it or tear it down. So there was discussion to tear down George Washington's home. We're talking 150, 200 years ago. And that created discussion nationwide that was asking, well, who are we as a country if we don't protect the home of the father of the country? At the same time, there was also the home of John Hancock, the big signature on the Declaration of Independence. And his home did actually get torn down and new buildings got put up. Again, this is 150 plus years ago, but that created some sort of fear and trepidation among some people in the national rhetoric saying, well, are we really a country about commercial real estate interest. This is the conversation that they're having. So two stark contrasts to each other, the George Washington home and the John Hancock home, and to have this debate and discussion early in this country's history.
And it's not about the building itself oftentimes.
Correct.
It's about what happened there, right?
The story it tells, the story that's attached to it.
And speaking of the connective tissue, there are certain things and sayings, you and I talk about this all the time, there's certain sayings that we say all the time without realizing the reason. One of it is when you say to somebody, you hand them a contract or whatever, and it's like, put your John Hancock right there.
That's
and people
right.
are like, why do we say that? That's why we say that.
That's right. Now, it's not always about buildings either. Now, you mentioned buildings, and absolutely, it's good, but it's also about something like archaeology, okay? So, for example, including the early republic, when the nation was young, there was a lot of appreciation in certain areas about old archaeological sites that they'd come across, especially masonry, stuff that looked like a lost civilization of the past. And the reason that they liked that is because they would call it ancient America. And this allowed us, the young little United States, to compete with Europe, to say, look, we too have ancient civilizations from the past. We too can hang, just like you have the cathedrals and the palaces and the ancient stuff there, we have it here too. So there was actually, because of that preservation, this connection, a hearkening of a past that predated the U.S., predated even European arrival, through archaeology, to point out and sort of attach ourselves to that identity and say, we too have this ancient history. Now, one of my favorite such sites that I like is Chaco Canyon out in New Mexico, a neighboring state. Many Texan folks, of course, visit New Mexico for tourism. And Chaco Canyon, I argue, is a lot like visiting ancient Rome. Rome is great, but you go there and you're going to find hundreds of sites, many masonry rooms. These rooms have, these buildings and establishments have hundreds of rooms in one plaza, and it's this whole subfield in archaeology, and it's incredible to visit. I'm telling you, when you go there, it is like going to ancient Rome. It is magical. It's hundreds of sites in one small area that was a center of influence across the entire region prior to Columbus arriving in the Americas.
And then speaking of the Americas, then you get into the Incan and the Mayan and the Aztec and all of that as well.
Yeah, that's right.
So you mentioned Rome. Well, let's just go to Egypt.
That's right. Now here we have papyrus from Egypt. My mom grew up in Egypt, and so I visited Egypt many different summers as I was growing up, visiting my grandparents. And so I brought the papyrus from Egypt from my trips, from my visits. It's actually from there. Now, what's interesting is when I was at a preservation research center recently, I met someone who had degrees in chemistry and art history. The same person had degrees in chemistry and art history. You might think, how do those two things connect? Well, right here on this papyrus they do. Because think about it, when you're looking at this, you're going to want to understand the art and understand the context in which it's being produced. That's the art history. But then when it's time to preserve this document, you have to literally understand the chemistry behind it so you can protect this document into perpetuity. So in preservation, which is not itself a discipline, it's actually sort of an approach that's combining different disciplines. In this case, chemistry and art history in ways that we find unimaginable. And myself, speaking of disciplines, this is my master's degree in historic preservation from University of Georgia. So I know, you know that I'm the real deal, because there it is with my name and the master's degree.
You better like put that on acid-free paper and put that in a frame.
That's right. I'm not doing a great job pressing it, am I? I'm just kind of hanging on to it in a roll.
You've always been interested in history since you were a little kid, but the idea of preservation kind of you had an epiphany while you worked at the Gettysburg battlefield.
I did. So when I worked at Gettysburg, I was drawn there because of the stories of the place. Now, there's a sense of place. But when I was there working, giving tours as a park ranger, what I asked myself was, well, these stories are fascinating, but how do you look around and how do you actually create and protect this landscape, this place? And it has more than 1,400 monuments and markers on it. In addition, how do you protect those monuments across time, many of which were put up by the soldiers themselves shortly after the war? And so we wanted to understand the management of the site and the actual physical preservation of it, and then also fundraising so you can actually have money to implement programs. While it's a National Park Service site, there are nonprofits that support it. That's how I got into my interest in understanding that preservation was even a thing. It wasn't just history. History is the stories and the documents and research, but it was historic preservation, which is entirely different, which is understanding the environment around you, the materials around you,
it's almost
so you
like
can actually understand what's happening.
This is the proof of what I just told you.
That's right. That's right. Exactly. And you can't tell, and they're connected, because in that case, you can't tell the story of the Battle of Gettysburg. You can't understand the Battle of Gettysburg until you stand there and experience the landscape undulations and the different views that they saw.
I don't know if I'm just one of those those weird people or not, but I always, when I go to places like this, I stand there for a minute, I'm like, be quiet, and then I feel it.
That's right. Now, I just want to say real quick that it's not, however, as much as I love historic sites, it's not just about historic sites, right? We talk about private citizens and such, and so there are resources here like Preservation Houston, there's Preservation Texas, it's statewide, and how about the Texas Historical Commission, which has...
And the Bryan Museum.
That's right, that's right.
Well.
Now, the Historical Commission has almost 20,000 highway markers across the state of Texas. Most of those markers are in front of sites that are not necessarily preserved like the Gettysburg battlefield, but still are a little reminder of the story that was or is in that particular point on the side of the highway. So sometimes it's simple acts like that that allow us to experience historic preservation.
All right, this history lesson is now over. Thank you very much, Raffi. And for more information on historian Raffi Andonian and links to local historic preservationists, visit greatdayhouston.com.